Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the kind of new album from actress Darren J. Cunningham, except it's in Russian letters. Alright, hope you've been enjoying the holiday season and that it hasn't been too stressful. I've still got some projects left from the end of this year that I want to cover and will probably need to be pushed into early next year. Gonna see if I can also get one more Patreon request shoved in before the year-end list, but we'll see how that goes. In the meantime, here's a quick discussion on that new Actress album from this past November. This will now mark my third time covering this guy. Links to my coverage of his 88 and Statik albums can be found in the description. I did mention in my Statik review that I decided I wanted to make proper videos on this guy's work going forward, since he's turned out to be interestingly fun to write about. He has a certain way of putting together these really subtle and low-key productions that may not pop out to most people on the surface, but when you really look deeper at what goes into it, it ends up feeling surprisingly unconventional and odd in such a way that no other artist I know really does. And it seems since switching labels from Ninja Tune over to Small Town Supersound, he's started to speed up his music-making process somewhat, this now being his third album just over the course of, like, a little over a year. Now, just as was the case with Statik, I initially planned to stick this in the lineup for that Some Stuff I Missed roundup I just uploaded, which, to be fair, I hadn't even listened to it yet. I just purely saw, like, the way it was structured, presented as a single 54-minute track. And between that, the way I saw some people talking about how nice its ambience was, the quick turnaround after his last album, which felt like that was being presented as more of an event, while this was more like a surprise drop that just kind of happened. And also keeping in mind just how ridiculously minimalistic and drone-like a listen Statik turned out to be, all of that gave me the impression that this was going to be like simple ambient drone album, and that it could be something I could stuff into a smaller segment in that roundup and be able to move on from fairly quickly. But as it turns out, I was just flat out wrong about the kind of album this actually was. Just on one listen I could tell this would also be better explored in a proper video, since despite being structured as a single lengthy track and also kinda looking like a drone album on the surface, there's actually just as much substance in this album as there is in any other mainline Actress album. And on top of that, it's actually a lot more dynamic a listen than Statik was. A lot easier to see on the surface just how many moving parts it really has. My favorite part of the album is just the opening stretch. Like the album's first 18 minutes or so. It feels like a continually evolving and shifting experimental piece that keeps me engaged by how it fades all these different unrelated elements in and out, but gets them all to feel like they really belong together, and like he reprises other elements at just the right times to make all of it feel cohesive. Mostly focusing on this exceptionally pretty piano loop that starts the album out, which is probably the single catchiest musical element on the whole album, and keeps showing up in various other points in this opening stretch. He fades in incomprehensible voice snippets, a very low-key but subtly heavy thumping techno beat, other hazy ambient pads in a different key from the piano loop, plinky melodic synth riffs that kind of feeling like they're sort of building upon and reconfiguring the melodies of that piano loop, sort of. Other blipping synth effects that twinkle upwards and downwards, processed cooing vocal pads to add to the ambience in a later section, and then everything just kind of fading into a very minimal hip-hop-ish beat by the end of this stretch. I think this whole section of the first 18 and a half minutes is probably the single most immersive and engaging part of the album. The way all these different elements drift in and out and instill this sort of dreamlike feeling in you is exactly the kind of thing I come to Actress's music for. Now, after the 18-minute mark, there is one section that feels like it could just be set apart as a completely isolated track. The whole bit from the 18.5-minute mark to around the 25-minute mark is just nothing but thumping kick drums that seem to switch off between being in 4/4 and 3/4, going up over some very light ambient pad pretty far in the background. It just kind of shows up, nothing else on the album sounds like it, and the idea isn't reprised again. And the entire rest of the album just kind of aimlessly shifts around and leaving you continually guessing where things might go next. nothing's ever reprised. It just fades from musical element to musical element ad nauseum. You get squirting bass effects leading into warm but muted synth harps and laser sound effects around the 25-minute mark. There's a minute of some kind of walkie-talkie garbling going over some slightly more expansive pad washes slowly fading in. Then past the 27-minute mark, it abruptly switches into an off-kilter mix of this weird processed piano chord and some sparse offbeat percussion mixes thumping around. It just stays there until the percussion starts to form more of a regular beat without any accompaniment around the half-hour mark. And finally, some other downbeat and moody pads and extremely light plucked textures give the mix some more body around the 31-32-minute mark. So many unpredictable twists and turns just in this fairly short stretch. Although that last mix lingers on for a good 5 minutes or so and lets you really sink yourself into all the indistinct fogginess. The next evolution of note isn't until around the 36-minute mark, where we get all these brighter and more bell-like keyboard tones fitting in and sort of lightening the mood for a short bit, with a few processed piano chords peeking in between the cracks. And past the 38-minute mark, there's this whole low-key jazzy piano solo being covered in reverb with someone's mumbling voice and some off-kilter MIDI percussion kind of tapping around without feeling like it's aligning itself to a recognizable pattern, although there probably is a pattern which just isn't easy to hear on the surface. And then 39.5 minutes in, you get easily the album's loudest techno beat just getting abruptly plopped on top of everything. Although by loudest, I just mean by volume and not like textural intensity. Despite how much bass it has and how much it swallows up the whole mix, it still feels relatively chill, as the pianos and mumbling samples continue in the background and also switch gender to a mumbling woman's voice later too. I think the beat starts playing in reverse around that point as well. And from a little after the 41-minute mark, there's a whole new section where that thicker techno beat cuts out and is replaced with a different robotic hip-hop beat, which just totally changes up the tempo and lingers around for the next 5 minutes. And that whole part also has some much icier ambient pads that sound pulled out of some old early 90s IDM record kind of floating through. From the 46.5-minute mark, the old mix fades out and makes way for a new loop of buzzing percussion taps and yawning pads and bass lines that have an oddly playful bend to them, by the standards of this album, I guess. And finally, the album ends in one last section from about the 49-minute mark onwards that just has a lot of super bass-boosted pianos playing abstract melodies over even more abstract electronic beatwork and other glitchy effects, as everything just kind of fades out at the end. You really just never know what you're going to get out of Darren J. Cunningham. Both the album and the artist, I suppose. But yeah, the album is such like an odd and unpredictable ride, and even if I don't think I love the album as a complete whole, and I didn't feel like anything kept me as well invested as the album's first 18 minutes or so did, there was no shortage of different ideas floating in and out that made sure I would never be totally checked out at any point through the full 54-minute running time. A lot of these sections had much more bite and striking texture to them than even the densest and most up-tempo moments of Statik, which isn't saying that much. Statik is all about just being really low-key and minimalistic, but still. And I think this album embodies what I've always enjoyed in Cunningham's music in the past to justify its status as technically being self-titled. I don't know where exactly I'd rank this album in terms of his overall catalog. I don't think I prefer it over his 88 album from last year, but it sits on a pretty similar level of enjoyment to that. It's very good, and if you're an Actress fan and thought maybe it'd be safe to skip out on this for the time being, I'm here to tell you you'd be missing out on some pretty dang cool stuff if you do. So yeah, I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. There are some people you want to add yourself that list or make me a review something. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.